Thank you again, everybody who is joining and register and joining now for the third international session of Let's Talk About Palm Oil. My name is Togar Sitanggang. For those that who has not joined any of my session before, Let's Talk About Palm Oil is basically my own session. It's not from Musimas or it's not from Gapki. It's really a personal things that I decided to do it to make a dialogue, basically by dialogue between people that are involved in the palm oil sector, because there's a lot of different perception from different stakeholders of palm oil. Usually academician and students also joining this session, also from civil society also joining, from the government side, from the industry. Is kind of a meeting point of all those that having interest, the same interest is palm oil. Whether they know about things here and there is the other different things, So, but a lot of people that commented to me after having the session is, "Oh, I don't know that. Now I know." Those kind of comments that I would love to see from everybody that having their part in this palm oil. Even me, sometimes that when someone presenting this, oh, I don't know that, and I become to know more and more about palm oil, and also I hope everybody also that join this this webinar or this discussion, feeling the same thing with me. So again, I thank you everybody that joining today, and hopefully we will have this international session, which I plan to have it every month, the first week of Thursday. But the time would be different, like we just discussed just now, whether it's in the evening to accommodate friends in Colombia, Ecuador, Honduras, Guatemala, what have you, in Central America and North America, or we have it in the afternoon Jakarta time, depending who's the speaker and everything like that. So my plan again, monthly, 1 month of Thursday, one times of Thursday every month will be the international session. The other three, usually I only take two Thursday. I have one libur, vacation, off, one Thursday off, not this one. It's not every Thursday I'm doing this. So it's 3 Thursday every month. Next month, hopefully David is still on with his Papua map, he was saying,
Yeah.
And for next week, for Bahasa session, for the local Indonesian session, I'm not sure who would be the speaker or the discussion topics, but on the 17th and 24th of September, Thursday of 17th, 24th, I already have 2 farmers that will speak up. 2 farmers that will talk about how they are doing things with the help of some other party. So that is the preliminary, I think, for those who is interested in the joining this discussion. Well, I think the very short introduction, I put it 10 minutes because in case I can running around, talking. But I guess we don't need to have a. We can put more discussion time than just me talking. You guys hearing me talking. All right, I'll give it to you, Erik. Please use the share screen and start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Togar. Let me pull this up. Can you see that all right?
Yes, started.
Let's see if we can get it in presentation mode. There we go. Oops. All right, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk here at the Let's Talk About Palm Oil conference sessions, webinar sessions. My name is Erik Meijaard. I'm a conservation scientist and practitioner, having worked since the early 1990s, mostly in Indonesia, mostly in Kalimantan, on the conservation of species like orangutan, but also very much looking into issues like sustainability of land use, climate, deforestation. And I've worked for many years on the economic, socioeconomic and biodiversity impacts of oil palm development in Kalimantan, in Indonesia, and also globally. So today I want to talk about palm oil from its environmental perspective, but not just talking about palm oil, taking it slightly larger, because I think a discussion just about palm oil in the light of global demand for vegetable oils is always a little bit limiting. I mean, palm oil is a crop, oil palm is a crop that produces high yields of vegetable oils. There is a growing demand globally for vegetable oils. So there is a choice to be made to which crop we're sourcing oils from. So I'd like to talk in this broader context. So I'll talk about that with regard to other oils as well, but focusing initially on palm oil. I represent the ICN. I chair the ICN Oil Palm Task Force. For those who don't know what the ICN is, it's the largest and most diverse environmental network. It's member-based, so several institutions from the Indonesian government, for example, are members of the ICN, and it's voluntary. It's a voluntary organization. So all the experts, species experts, someone like myself who chairs a task force on behalf of the ICN, are doing this on a voluntary basis. In 2016, the ICN members called for the establishment of a task force through a resolution, Resolution 61, recognizing that the organization, the ICN, did not have sufficient knowledge about oil palm and its impacts on the environment and on biodiversity. So this task force was established. I was asked to chair it. And one of the things that were asked through the resolution was for us to conduct a situation analysis on the implications of biodiversity conservation, or the implication of the expansion of oil palm on biodiversity conservation. The mandate of these task forces is 4 years. So we're coming in 2020 now to the end of the task force. And I need to start talking about what do we do in the next 4 years for the task force. So I also hope to use this discussion following my presentation to get ideas about what people find important in terms of research or policy focus to work on, and potentially what role the task force could play. I already mentioned this. This study, this situation analysis, which we published in 2018, initially in English and French. And in 2019, an Indonesian translation was published and made available freely to the public. It's an objective, neutral study on this very high polarized debate about palm oil. And one of the reasons I focused on palm oil is that I've always been slightly confused about this very black and white context of the discussions around palm oil. But people seem to either love palm oil or absolutely hate it, and there seems to be nothing in between, which is not particularly useful for finding solutions of improving things on the ground. So we tried to have a very objective study here. Objectivity was also guided or protected by the input from over 40 external reviewers. So the draft document was put online, was kept online for 3 months, allowing anyone who wanted to comment on the contents of the report to provide input. And we answered all the comments and questions, put the questions and answers online. So there was an open process about what we think is the best and the most objective science about the past. So looking at what oil palm expansion, what the environmental impacts have been, what the biodiversity impacts have been. The present, what is happening about reducing these impacts in terms of governance and management and certification. And what does the future look like in terms of a growing demand for vegetable oils, in terms of expansion of the oil palm industry in Africa and South America, and also in terms of the other oil crops that are also contributing towards meeting the future demand for vegetable oils. Just a quick slide. I mean, probably we all know, I can be very brief here. Palm oil is the most used vegetable oil on Earth. It's in many products that you use throughout your day on a daily basis, unless you make a concerted effort to exclude palm oil from your life. Generally important to consumers, generally also important to producers. And I've just listed here in this table on the right the contribution of palm oil to the GDP of different countries, palm oil exports, so not just local national consumption, but export, and that's significant. Indonesia, 1.5% contribution to GDP. Malaysia, it's 3%. Papua New Guinea, it's also high, which is sort of in the same order of magnitude as the contribution of agriculture, for example, in the Netherlands, where I am from. So it's important as an agricultural commodity for foreign revenue earnings in these countries. Some maps, because there's a lot of talk about palm oil, but people actually seem to have quite a strange view about how much oil palm there actually is. This is a paper we just put online. The title here is here on the bottom right: High Resolution Global Map of Smallholder and Industrial Closed Canopy Oil Palm Plantations. It's online as a preprint publication. And we show in this that oil palm covers about 21.5 to 23.4 million hectares globally. That includes both industrial scale and smallholder. Smallholder is about 1/3 of that total. A different study, we looked at the deforestation it causes globally, and we found this figure of less than 0.5%. I've seen a study by the EU. It claims 2% of all global deforestation being caused by oil palm expansion. The point being, it's actually relatively low if you look at the global scale. Now, of course, if you look at where palm oil is grown, oil palm is a tropical crop. So it's grown in a relatively narrow belt of about 20 degrees latitude around the equator. Here on the top, you see in South and Central America, it's quite patchy, quite small. The blue spots that you see are the areas where oil palm is planted for commercial exploitation. The same in Western Central Africa, where the oil palm originally comes from. So there is actually a lot of oil palm in forest settings, in a natural setting, or agroforestry settings where people are using it traditionally. That is not something we can at the moment pick up with remote sensing. So these are really the larger areas of planted oil palm. And those predominate, as we know, in Southeast Asia, in mostly Sumatra, Indonesian and Malaysian, Borneo, Kalimantan, and peninsular Malaysia, and to a certain extent also in Thailand, where large areas of oil palm have been developed and are associated to, for example, in Malaysian Borneo, about 55% of deforestation being directly caused by oil palm. So at a global scale, oil palm is not a major contributor to deforestation. Locally, it is, and that creates this anxiety around biodiversity as it affects species like orangutans in Borneo and Sumatra, bears, tigers, and so on. And it is a problem for biodiversity. Using the IUCN Red List, which is the globally available, accessible database from the IUCN about threatened species. So each of the species on that list is assessed by species specialists that know the chimpanzee or the tiger or the gibbon or the cassowary, and they're saying these and these and these things are threats. That could be hunting, it could be disease, it could be expansion of agriculture. And if the assessor says oil palm is a threat, We have recorded that information, and there are 193 species considered to be critically endangered, and vulnerable that have palm oil production as one of their main threats. Now, that's a significant number of species, and therefore a real concern for biodiversity conservation. It's really quite simple. If you compare the biodiversity of a tropical rainforest with the biodiversity of an oil palm, a monocultural oil palm plantation, of course, the biodiversity of an oil palm plantation is much less than a tropical rainforest. It's almost a no-brainer. Having said that, of course, that's the case for any agriculture, whether you take rice or maize or wheat or cacao or coffee or anything else. A monoculture of anything always is going to have less biodiversity than a natural ecosystem, be it a tropical rainforest or a natural savanna, grassland savanna, or a boreal forest, where also we see oil crops expanding into natural forest areas, for example, in areas like Canada. There are not just concerns around biodiversity, there are other environmental impacts associated with palm oil production, as indicated in this figure. Deforestation I mentioned, invasive species, including some of the pollinators that are used in oil palm production that are not native to the environment, and we know very little about what the ecological effects are of that. Depending on the management, it affects soil fertility. Again, depending on the quality of management, it can impact water quality and fisheries, depending on how the palm oil residue, the palme, is managed. It requires a lot of water, so water supply and regulation can be affected. If palm oil expansion displaces wildlife, it can lead to increased conflicts between people and wildlife. For example, if orangutans are being pushed out of the forest into people's gardens where they eat the durian and the rambutan, poor farmers get annoyed. So you end up with conflicts or even killing of wildlife. And there are other effects on peatland drainage, fire, smoke and haze, and also increased temperature. The temperature of agricultural land, open land, is much higher than the temperature of a tropical rainforest. And if you open enough tropical rainforest, it really starts to affect the temperature and also rainfall in large areas. So we see this for Borneo, for example, where the rainfall over the past 30 years has decreased by 800 millimeters per year, and the temperature has gone up by nearly 2 degrees centigrade. That might sound small, but could actually have major impacts on the health of people, disease outbreaks, and also the ecological health and survival of a range of species. So it's a complex package of lots of environmental impacts that we describe in this report. I also work on the other side of oil palm. I recently visited, at the request of the RSPO, 5 companies where we thought they had good biodiversity management, to look at how do oil palm companies, palm oil companies, address the challenge of biodiversity management within their land holdings. And this has been very interesting. We traveled to Brazil to look at the company there, Agropalma, who've set aside 60% of their land holdings for conservation. This is not so much a decision by the company. Of course, it is a decision by the company, but it's more driven by policies of the Brazilian government dating back to the 1980s and 1990s, where each landholder was required to set aside large areas of their land holdings for conservation purposes. Of course, not everyone did this, but Agropalma did. So they have 100,000 hectares, which is 1,000 square kilometers of land, of which 60% is set aside and really well managed for conservation purposes. A company I've worked with myself, Austindo Nusantara Jaya in Indonesia, with concessions in Kalimantan, Sumatra, Belitung, and Papua. They asked me to come in 2011 to look at a problem of a breeding population of orangutans that subsequently has been protected, or at least part of their habitat has been protected. And there's a population of 150 to 200 orangutans sitting within the area managed by the palm oil company, of which I am pretty sure that forest wouldn't exist anymore if the palm oil company hadn't managed it, because I've seen all the other forests around it being illegally logged and burned over in the years that area by the company was managed. So there is definitely a loss in forest, but there's also the potential to maintain biodiversity through management with oil palm companies. Another example, Rea Kaltim in East Kalimantan, doing a lot of work on a highly endangered crocodile species, of which there may only be one or two or few populations left in the world, one of which is in one of their areas. The company has got some crocodile specialists working with them, is doing a lot of good work towards the conservation of that species. We were asked by the RSPO to look at this to see whether the companies were doing this because of RSPO certification. As it turned out, it looked more like they were doing this either, as the case in Agropalma, because the government required them to do this, or because the owner said, this is what we're going to do with a majority shareholder, this is what we're going to do. So certification may have played a role, but the key driver of this biodiversity management was really company owners that wanted this to happen. The upshot of this is that there's significant spending within certain oil palm companies, and this is just a small section that we looked at, 5 companies, of between $6 and $53 of high conservation value forest areas per year. And to put that in perspective, that is vastly higher than protected area spending in developing countries. So I think there's scope for looking at biodiversity management in oil palm concession, not looking just at oil palm as a destroyer of biodiversity, but as the expansion of the industry is kind of slowing down, to also look at what can be done within these multifunctional landscape by working with oil palm companies on the management of biodiversity. As an example, this is the orangutans that I've worked on in West Kalimantan, where we're now looking at several oil palm concessions, the forest areas they have set aside, that you see here on the left in the photo. Within the further distance, Gunung Palung National Park. And if you look behind us from this photo, you'd see the very large Sungai Putri peat swamp forest that is currently managed by International Animal Rescue, that could have up to 1,500 orangutans. Now, how can we connect these areas with forest patches and forest corridors managed with the oil palm? So we really start looking at these larger multifunctional landscapes where oil palm is already developed, and we need to do something to ensure that that ecological connectivity between these areas is not lost, and you retain functioning ecological landscapes. Just coming back to this example of Agropalma, as I said, their total holdings are about 100,000 hectares, of which 64,000, or it's more than 100,000, 64,000 hectares is set aside for conservation, shown here in the central map in green. And as things are now in Brazil or in the Amazon, there's at least 2 species of birds that only seem to occur within the plantation areas, or within the forest set-aside areas of Agropalma. So whether you like it or not, Agropalma has a key role to play in the survival of these species, including this bird here, the dark-winged trumpeter, and the golden parakeet here on the bottom left. So again, it's an example where oil palm companies, through the management of forest set-aside conservation areas, can play a key role in the protection and management of highly threatened species of plants, birds, and other biodiversity. So here we're coming to the other oil crops. I think it's always interesting. There's a lot of focus on oil palm, and of course, as I said, oil palm has had a major negative impact in recent decades on natural ecosystems, especially tropical rainforests in Malaysia and Indonesia. On the other hand, there are other tropical crops such as peanut, which has got larger areas of planted areas, coconut, which is also a significant crop, especially on smaller islands, that no one seems to look at. And when I talk about coconut, people say, well, you're just trying to defend oil palm. No, what I'm saying is that if you really want to start talking about sustainability, we need to understand the impacts of all these crops, not just oil palm, but also peanuts and coconut and olive and sunflower and rapeseed and soy and maize, especially maize and soy, which of course are huge crops, with soy especially having major impacts on the destruction of natural ecosystems in South America. So let's broaden that discussion, not just having the focus on palm oil, but also the focus on some of these other oils. The problem with that is that we don't have global maps of any of these crops. We've now got a map for the oil palm of the world, but there's no map of the peanut of the world, or there's no map of the coconut of the world, or there's no map really of the soy of the world. So without having these maps, it's really hard to say what the past impacts have been of the expansion of these crops on the environment, on biodiversity. And to have an informed discussion about the environmental impacts of palm oil, we need to know what the environmental impacts of these other crops has been. Just a few facts about these other crops. The top three, oil palm, coconut, and olive, are of course long-lived species. Oil palm having a cycle of 25 years, coconut longer, and olive trees. I'm giving this presentation from Greece, and I was not long ago in an olive yard area where trees were as old as 2,000 years. So they're seriously long-lived lived species. All the other crops are annuals. That generally means they have really low biodiversity in their crop areas, because every year all the vegetation disappears and then it gets grown again. Oil palm and coconut, of course, are the tropical crops where the expansion has an impact on tropical environments. Soybean, cotton, and groundnuts are more subtropical. Olive is Mediterranean, and rapeseed and maize and sunflower are more temperate, nearly boreal crops. Each has therefore a different number of species associated with it that are either threatened or species richness. If you look here in the column on the right, oil palm is the highest average number of species associated with it compared to the other crops. So these are differences to keep in mind. Another important difference is that oil palm, as I mentioned earlier, yields more tons of oil per hectare than any of the other crops, which is important if you start looking at crop expansion into the future to meet future demands. Just to give you an example of what that future demand is going to be, and let's not look at the details. This is a very rough example of what could happen. There is a prediction that the global demand for vegetable oils for consumption, for animal feed, for food, for biofuel could be as much as 310 megatons. Currently, it's about 170, so 170 megatons. So a significant growth predicted related to growing human populations, growing consumption, growing demand in general. Now, ideally, all that demand, increased demand, is met on existing holdings of vegetable crops by increasing the yields. To what extent that's possible is not entirely clear, but it's not going to lead to fully meet that global demand. So if you can't meet it through increased yields, you need to expand the cropland. Otherwise, you can't meet the demand unless you stop consuming oils. Now, I played with two simple scenarios. Either we say no to palm oil and we restrict palm oil at 50 megatons. That's scenario one. That means that all the additional production needs to come out of rapeseed, soybeans, sunflower, cottonseed, with especially soybean requiring a huge expansion of its crop area, mostly in the Americas and maybe China. Scenario two is where we allow palm oil production to increase to 200 megatons, and then the land is much more evenly divided between the crops. Now, for scenario one, if you see here on the left, we would need an additional 300 million hectares. For scenario two, we need an additional 4 million hectares. So I just want to indicate, don't look at the details, I just want to indicate that this question about which crop is going to produce the oil of the future leads to vastly different outcomes in terms of land needed, and through that also the price of oil. Price of oil, palm oil being the oil of choice for poor people because it is a cheap oil. Prices go up, it has an impact, a socioeconomic impact, that again we need to understand before any policy decisions are made on how this pans out. So important decisions to make. I think therefore, and this is what we said in the ICN report, palm oil is not going to disappear, even if there is a ban on palm oil trade for biofuel, reductions in imports from certain countries. It's very likely that Indonesia and Malaysia will keep on producing palm oil because it is a productive crop that is used locally as well as for export. Because of these yield differences, this has major impacts on land use. This is the graphic that was used with the report. 1 ton of palm oil requires about 1/4 hectare of land. Rapeseed oil 5 times as much, sunflower oil 6 times as much, and soybean oil 8 times as much. So again, it is really important in terms of meeting future demands on how the land is allocated, not just from an environmental, but also from a socioeconomic perspective. In addition to the discussion on how new land is allocated to palm oil, we need to ask how that oil palm is managed. And that's where certification and sustainability discussions come into play. Currently, about 20% of oil palm is certified under the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil Principles and Criteria certification. 80% is non-certified. There have been a lot of studies on the impact of certification, most seeing either no impact of certification or a marginal impact. So I'm very clear on RSPO certification that even though I think it's a very good thing that's being attempted, it hasn't clearly achieved what it set out to do. So I think there is need for further thinking. I guess that point was made by a recent paper by Roberto Gatti that you may have seen, where he said science confirms palm oil is unsustainable even if certified. But the argument he uses is saying any areas that are currently oil palm in Malaysia and Indonesia were forested areas 40 years ago before the forest was cut down. So therefore we can never call it sustainable. It's one way of looking at it. I kind of think that it's a little bit arbitrary to say that therefore oil palm can't be sustainable, but maybe if it was coconuts where the land clearing happened 75 years ago, then it's okay. Or if it was olive expansion in Spain that happened 50 years ago when EU subsidies started to really help these sectors to expand, then it's okay. I think it's a little arbitrary. If we look overall how things look in Indonesia, this is a paper that David Gavo, the next speaker, international speaker in this session, is working on. I'm working on with him on that. Oil palm expansion in Indonesia is really strongly in decline. This is the oil palm expansion within the industrial sector. If you look, there's another figure of the smallholder sector, and it looks pretty much the same. You see the expansion per year between 2019 and 2000. For Kalimantan, the expansion peaks in 2010. The light part of each bar is the part where oil palm expanded in non-forest land. The dark part is where oil palm expanded on forested land. So the overall picture, and we've demonstrated, is that most oil palm expansion in Indonesia happened on land that was already deforested. Although, as Gatti mentioned, it was deforested 40 years ago, and therefore oil palm is still culpable for that deforestation. The peak year in Sumatra was about 2007. Java, which of course is very small in terms of oil palm, 2006. Sulawesi 2009. Maluku 2012, and then Papua 2015. So there's a shift I guess from Java to Sumatra to Kalimantan to Sulawesi to Papua, of that wave of oil palm development passing through Indonesia, west to east. But in all these areas, the expansion is in decline. And I kind of hope that this is a moment where we can start to have a fresh look at the oil palm sector, where things start to stabilize. Maybe 10 years ago, it was Wild West, everyone was expanding, and it was very difficult to control, big problems with fires and haze and smoke and land conflicts. Hopefully things start to calm down and we can really start looking at consolidating landscapes and areas with oil palm, with other agricultural commodities, and with forest and wildlife in there, and see how we can manage these landscapes better. My last slide, if I'm not mistaken, there are some major questions to be answered. I mentioned one already. I'd really like to know, we now know where oil palm is grown. I'd like to know where the other oil crops are grown, so we can have a look at the past environmental and biodiversity impacts of all the oil crops. Make an assessment of how that varies between crops, then start looking at yield variation between crops and within crops. So it basically tells us how we could meet the future demand through a combination of expansion, smart allocation or optimal allocation of land to different oil crops, and focusing on yield improvement on existing land holdings of oil palm. In terms of broader sustainability, we then also need to look at the socioeconomic benefits and costs of different expansion of different crops, and ultimately that information needs to be on the table of policymakers. I look at the discussion between the EU and Malaysia and Indonesia, and I just sometimes think there is just not enough information available to have a meaningful discussion about these broad impacts, like a broad context of sustainability. So I think there's a real urgent need to provide further information to policymakers so we have a more informed discussion about the environmental and socioeconomic impacts of vegetable oil production at large, and oil palm specifically. And I think that was my presentation. So I'll stop sharing and give it back to you, Togar. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. Well, yeah, before we go into discussion, announcement, like Erik has I mentioned in the very early conversation with Erik, David will be on the next speaker on the international session. It will be on the Thursday, 1st of October. But the time of the presentation and or discussion will not be, I'm still need to talk to David in detail. Second thing is, like I said, next week, I don't know whether or not I will put the normal Bahasa Indonesia session on the Thursday afternoon. But for sure, so on the 17th and the 24th, I already have something. Farmers will be, will be sitting on the speakers on the Bahasa Indonesia session. And the other thing is that Chatham House rule applied for us. So everybody should feel free to speak, to talk. Okay, let's go for the discussion session. I see Mona has raised the hand. Also from the private, directly to me, Doris was trying to ask question also, and also Michelle. Okay, all the ladies, please, Mona Lisa, Michelle, and Doris, to ask your question. Please, Mona first.